Hello, and welcome back to the Sustainability Talks podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Sheehan, Managing Partner at ETF Partners, Europe's oldest and leading venture capital firm focused on backing businesses that deliver what we call sustainability through innovation. In today's episode of Sustainability Talks, we're speaking with Kristian Rönn, CEO and co-founder of our portfolio company Normative. It's the world's leading emissions accounting engine, helping businesses calculate their entire carbon footprint and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Following his appearance at COP26, we sat down with Kristian to discuss the genesis and exponential growth of the business and how today Normative is partnering with the likes of Google to support organizations as they commit to achieving net zero. Leading this conversation with Kristian are my partner at ETF, Fabrice Bienfait, and our head of investor relations and sustainability, Zoë VanderWolk.
So we'll kick off with this big topic. I'm very pleased to have my colleagues Zoë and Kristian on this call. Maybe just to set the scene, we talked earlier about this IPCC report that tells us that we have around 10 years to save the planet. So a real call for action there. Obviously, governments at COP this year have renewed their commitment to reduce carbon emissions. But measuring carbon is quite hard, and we'll talk about that. We need to get that right. And what we'll talk about as well is actually businesses emit most of the carbon. And we hear a lot about big businesses announcing net zero targets, but at the same time, very few account properly for their emissions. So there's this question, how credible those net zero targets are. But anyway, so that's setting the scene. So first, I have my colleague Zoë VanderWolk with us. She's head of impact in our team. So maybe Zoë, a few words about you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Fabrice. My name's Zoe. I'm the head of sustainability, and I look after all the impact and sustainability related stuff here at ETF. By training, I'm actually a statistician, so the data is dear to my heart in terms of measurement and recording as well. And it's not every day that one of our portfolio companies has such a personal impact on me, since obviously I am the one responsible for crunching through all the numbers in terms of carbon, not only for us at ETF, but also looking at that for all of our portfolio companies as part of various, obligations. So Kristian, you're having a personal impact on me as well as the rest of the world, making my job a happier experience. And I really look forward to working with Normative on our carbon needs.
Yeah, it's a very important role you have, Zoë. It's not only for us an obligation to report, but it's really a mission to do so as well. So Kristian, for full disclosure, I mentioned that we were very, very happy to co-lead the Series A financing round into your business earlier this summer, a 10 million round. Really great news for the business. And you're a co-founder and the CEO of Normative. Normative is a carbon accounting software business, so really addressing this huge need for businesses to have a tool they can use to kind of direct their net zero strategy. So thanks for joining this afternoon. How are you?
Thank you, Fabrice. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm good. Very excited to be here.
I know you're in Sweden, and it's probably already dark out there in the north.
It is.
You have such an interesting background. I thought we start with maybe your story. You work for years in that space as a researcher, as an entrepreneur. Tell us a bit more about it.
Yep. So my background, long story short. So my background is in academia, in mathematics and philosophy. I specialized in artificial intelligence. My great passion for many years, and the reason why I've done carbon accounting for a decade is my passion for reducing global risks. So we have some of these major challenges that humanity is facing as we are industrializing. We have emerging technologies, and the fact is that most people that will ever live on planet Earth will most likely live in the future. So if we mess things up today, we will mess it up for thousands of years to come. So that is the basic logic that made me interested in carbon accounting. So,
you're setting the bar very high in terms of being a mission-driven entrepreneur.
Yeah, but that was more of a from an academic perspective. So 8 years back, I was working for a research institute at the University of Oxford, where we tried to model various types of global risks. And I decided to leave and start a tech startup out of what I felt like was necessity, because publishing more papers on the fact that the climate crisis is urgent is not really going to move the needle. You need to actually take data, put it in the hands of the large polluters, which are the enterprises, and change the decision making as they are making their decisions. So that's what I left Oxford in order to start Normative 10 years ago. And back then, we felt a bit, crazy. We're the only software company out there, and not a lot of companies listened to us. But now, in the past few years, we have seen this exponential growth in the sector, and obviously we have grown a lot within Normative as well.
Yeah, I guess there's been a real acceleration in the last 2 years around that theme, and as you mentioned, you used to be a bit on your own in that space, but we hear a lot about new companies starting in that space of carbon accounting. Well, how do you make Normative? How did you make Normative unique? Is that through the use of technology? You mentioned your background in AI, but what's really your recipe?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And first of all, I think it's welcomed that we're seeing more companies joining the space. So in the past year or so, we see new competitors joining all the time. It means that we feel slightly less crazy, like the only crazy company doing this. But jokes aside, what I think really puts us in part is the fact that we have been in this market for 8 years. We really know how the standards work better than anyone else. I mean, we're partnering with some of the large institutions out there that are setting the standards for net zero, like the UN Race to Zero campaign, Carbon Disclosure Project, Women Business Coalition, and so on. But when it comes to the actual software, what makes us unique is our focus on, first of all, accounting for the full carbon footprint. So this is not a simple carbon calculator. You start by uploading every single, transaction and invoice in your spend base. And we make sure, that is the way we make sure that, we actually capture all of the data that you upload, and the cost should essentially add up to the cost in your P&L. So that is a kind of, way we assure that we have captured everything. But that, might involve, thousands of suppliers or tens of thousands of suppliers, and estimating the carbon footprint for it, which means that you need to have a very solid infrastructure as well, knowing what type of businesses and goods and services and their carbon impact. And that is, an infrastructure that we have built for the past 8 years. So that is first the focus on full carbon footprint, not just a small subset, but the full carbon footprint in your operation and in your supply chain. And then I think also our focus on reducing your footprint. So we have a great team that will actually provide our premium customers with specific advice, exactly what can they do in order to decarbonize. And we can do it for individual companies, we can do it for large investment portfolios. So we do not just leave them with numbers, but we actually tell them what can they do in order to reduce, and we engage with their supply chain and value chain to make that reduction happen even outside the organization or in the so-called scope 3 emissions. So that is the long answer of what makes us unique.
No, but it's really impressive. And we'll go back to it. And what I'd like to you do as well, you told me a little bit about COP26, you were there. So maybe stepping back a little bit and tell us a bit how high on the agenda carbon measurement was at COP. What was your impression around COP? Did you feel as well that sense of urgency around there?
Yeah. So I think the overall experience from a company perspective was quite exciting. I mean, in the end of the day, we as a world, we did not achieve what we set up to do at COP. We were there to keep 1.5 degrees alive, and we ended up with more like 2.4 degrees in the overall commitments. But the message that we wanted to spread there at COP is that we have governments that are there setting targets for reducing their emissions, but it's actually the companies within the jurisdictions of the governments that are polluting. So that means that you need rigorous carbon disclosures for companies in order to track that the reduction is taking place. So I think that conversation is incredibly important. But just to add to that as well, I mean, we met with Al Gore and John Kerry, and everyone was talking about carbon disclosures. But what was kind of brushed under the rug a little bit is the fact that you need proper accounting procedures and standards for how to actually account. I mean, you might have frameworks for how to disclose carbon, but unless you have the right accounting mechanisms where you actually have carbon disclosures that are comparable between different legal entities, we will have a huge problem, especially since it is recognized that we need to move trillions from sustainable to non-sustainable companies on the backbone of carbon disclosures. And if we can't trust that mechanism, then that money is not really allocated effectively.
What you're saying is today we are not really comparing like with like. Different companies use different standards and rules, and maybe sometime trying to look better. That's interesting. Actually, it's a key issue. One thing as well, I wanted to. We hear a lot of talking about the vocabulary people are using. We hear a lot about businesses announcing net zero targets. What does net zero mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. So essentially, what needs to happen is that the world needs to reach net zero emissions by 2050, the latest, to keep 1.5 alive, and we need to slash our emissions in half every single decade. So net zero is a journey, and net zero. That doesn't mean same as absolute zero. I mean, there will be a residual of maybe 10% or so of global emissions that we actually don't know how to kind of get rid of them. So I mean, something might be, airplanes, for instance. Do we have a really good substitute that doesn't release any emissions? No, I mean, we don't. I mean, we're figuring out concrete and steel, and of course, electric cars and that sort of stuff. But there will be a residual that we haven't figured out. And in order to actually, combat that, we need to invest in nature-based solutions and carbon removals, actually extract carbon from the atmosphere in order to achieve our targets. So that's a little bit the difference between net zero and absolute zero.
Sure. No, thanks for clarifying that. I think, Zoe, you have a question, and I'm guessing is around reporting standards and governance, since it's a big topic on your agenda at ETF.
It is. I mean, net zero obviously plays straight into, what people are doing, but obviously there is a lot of criticism that is greenwashing, right? So people are announcing net zero targets, and when you look into how they plan to meet those, sometimes it's offsets, sometimes it's aspirational. Like, we know where we need to be, which is over here, and we know where we are, which is over here, and then it's a kind of question mark to get, in between. And, one of the things that is very clear is that carbon accounting software seems to address the sort of operational carbon of companies and how, but it's not necessarily going to account for that reduction. So for instance, say that we invested in a CCS project, how would that be accounted within, carbon sort of accounting standards? I have yet to see any emerging standards that seem to, sort of take into account that aspect. But do you think that there's a way that businesses today, do you see people coalescing around a particular standard, or are we still an alphabet soup, world?
I would say that there's still an alphabet soup. And I think there's lots of kind of disclosure standards out there, like, TCFD, CDP, GRI, SASB. You have all of these, different disclosure standards out there with, interesting acronyms. But none of them have really addressed what I think is a fundamental problem. That is the actual accounting procedure for how you produce the disclosures in the first place. I mean, I think a similar metaphor here is the profit and loss statement. I mean, you have behind every profit and loss statement, you have a well-defined double entry bookkeeping procedure encoded into software that will essentially spit out that P&L. And as in the investors can trust that the P&L of one company is comparable to the P&L of another company. And that is the whole kind of backbone of the financial system. But the problem is that we can't really do that today. I mean, there is an accounting standard that is like 20 plus years old called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard, but that is not very specific. And it's not specific and doesn't have mechanisms in place of how can we actually assure that the full scope of emissions are accounted for. And that's what we see again and again, that it's not, properly accounted for. And then, I think on top of that, we need, a more rigorous like net zero standard. And sorry if I'm, going on a tangent here, but I think you mentioned offsetting and some people using offsets as a part of their definition of net zero. And that is not a part of the definition of net zero. So there's a lot of confusion between so-called, carbon neutrality and net zero. So I mean, what we see over and over again, which we try to warn companies about, is that, you might hire a consultant that does some simplified carbon calculation. It actually only covers, 10% of your total footprint. And then that same consultant just happens to be selling a so-called carbon offset, which is, planting a few trees. And a lot of those tree planting projects don't fulfill the properties of additionality, non-leakage, which is, essentially the geeky way of saying, they don't work. They don't claim to do what they're doing. They only have, perhaps a 10% or less effectiveness of what they claim to have. So if you multiply the 10% with the 10%, then you have actually only, removed 1% of your total emissions, and then kind of put the stamp of, net zero, of carbon neutral on your packaging. Yeah. The companies actually don't know about it. So it's
kind of scary what you're describing.
Voluntary greenwashing in a sense.
Yeah, it's very scary what you're describing. I mean, in a way, it's a bit like cooking the book of carbon accounting, what's going on, or creative accounting around carbon, and then creative offsetting, we could say. But in a way, we use that word accounting, and I guess one of the reasons why we invested in Normative is we do really believe that carbon accounting ultimately will become as big as financial accounting. In the world of finance, as you say, we have standards like GAAP. We have auditors. We have a lot of things to make sure the numbers are right, and sometimes there are still people getting away with things. But so, what do we need in this world of carbon emission to create the right framework in your mind? Where are we on that journey?
Yep. I think a good analogy here is the financial accounting and the evolution of financial accounting, reporting, and disclosures. So I mean, 600 years ago, double entry bookkeeping, kind of the way we know it today, what was invented in Venice for merchants to keep track of profits and losses. Like fast forward, a few hundred years, you have to start to get the standardization of kind of a profit and loss statement. Some of that is like actually enshrined into the legal system that, companies are supposed to maximize profit according to this definition of accounting for things. And then obviously in the 20th century, a lot of bookkeeping procedures got, encoded into software in the 70s. And then, together, side by side with this, you have all of the auditing firms and auditing standards. I mean, this is how we actually audit a financial report. Here's a checklist of the questions that we will need to ask as an external auditor. So I think, we need the carbon equivalent of all of those things. And we can't wait, 600 years for it to happen. It needs to happen, within the next few years in order for us to have a fighting chance. And I think,
Kristian, do we even need it? We don't even have it for companies now. We see companies reporting GAAP and non-GAAP, for instance. So, I've seen people say things like, well, I'm going to wait until it's all, a standard emerges. Do we even need to wait for a standard to emerge?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, you need some kind of standardization in order to be able to compare apples to apples. But then the question, do we need for someone else to, kind of build a standard? I mean, that's not what we're doing at Normative. I mean, we are, trying to build the standard and we're trying to do that in a way where we actually engage with other stakeholders and not just be, the I don't know, naive tech startup trying to do everything on our own.
Maybe just a bit on carbon accounting again, just so we understand why it's tricky. So if you think about the protocol, the GHG protocol, people talk about scope 1, scope 3 emissions. I mean, again, as you said, so many acronyms. But I think talking to you clearly, what is tricky is scope 3. And so tell us a bit more about that, why it's so important to get scope 3 right. I mean, what is scope 3? Yeah. What should we get it right? And how can we get it right?
Yep. Great question. So to understand what scope 3 means, let's define scope 1 and scope 2 first. So scope 1, roughly speaking, is direct emissions from your operations. So that might be, combustion engines of various sorts. I mean, in your vehicle fleet, for instance, the vehicle fleet that you operate yourself, or I mean, if you're a farmer and if you own cows, they might release some methane gas, or if you have a big pile of trash, it might, release methane gas, or if you produce, concrete or steel, that might, release carbon emissions. So it's like essentially the direct emissions from your operations. And if you take an average company, and obviously Shell is not an average company, or the big steel manufacturing companies are not an average company. But if you just take any company, then maybe 5% of their total emissions will be in scope 1. Then you have scope 2, which is kind of in your operations. I mean, it's emissions from utilities. But you have kind of direct control of it. I mean, if you turn on your thermostat in the office, or use more electricity, then there is a direct causal link between that and the direct emissions. So it's emissions from utilities essentially, and then scope 3 is all of the value chain based emissions. So that might be all of the products and services that you buy and then perhaps resell if you're a retail store. It might be the transportation services that you buy that are not within your own operations. You might, recruit DHL or Maersk or whatever to transport your goods. So all of those other things, and that typically account for 90% of your overall emissions. And what makes this, tricky to calculate is first assure that you have the full scope, that you actually try and estimate all, relevant categories. And I mean, essentially our way of solving that is to say, hey, let's upload all of your spend transactions, supplier lists, activities into Normative, and let's see if that adds up to the cost base of your P&L. So then at least we have tried to estimate all of the emissions in your scope 3. Yeah, sorry.
What if there's an overlap though? Because obviously, so I'm thinking about us here at ETF, our scope 3 includes your scope 1, surely, because you are part of our portfolio. So your scope 3, your scope 1 and 2 is our scope 3, right? Yeah. So if every company in the world started reporting, how do you account for things like overlaps?
Yeah, I mean, and that's why you have the difference between scope 1, 2, and 3. If everyone in the world accounts, then the total emissions in the world are the scope 1 emissions that is aggregated, right? And that's a little bit the thing. I mean, the way we start with our clients is that they upload their entire spend base, we estimate their carbon emissions, but then you will see certain hotspots, certain suppliers or materials that seem to have a lot more carbon emissions than something else. And then we try to help our clients engage with those suppliers. And this is actually where some of the exciting work we're doing with the UN Race to Zero campaign, We Mean Business Coalition, and Exponential Roadmap enters the picture. So we have started this initiative called the SME Climate Hub, where we can it's a platform where large companies can engage their suppliers to report on their scope 1, scope 2 emissions, essentially, because that's the way they can kind of collect more accurate data from the supply chain. And so far, through that initiative, we have gotten 3,500 companies to sign a net zero commitment, which is the largest campaign in the world for net zero commitments, at least in absolute numbers, which is pretty exciting.
No, that's very impressive. So if I understand correctly, just to summarize, you would say, so scope 1 and scope 2, in a way, most of the data is internal to the business. So it's easier. Scope 3, it's really engaging with your supply chain. That means you need data from your suppliers. So it's harder. You can use technology, but in the end, you need information sharing. And that's what you're trying to achieve through the net zero campaign and maybe other information sharing platform. Because I guess I guess we're not there yet. So today, how do you do it? That data is not available. You make assumptions.
Exactly.
You beg.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, you make assumptions. So we essentially rely on life cycle assessments for different categories. So that would be saying, okay, let's say you have procured a bunch of cement for your buildings. Let's say you are a construction company, you're using Normative. Then we essentially have data, okay, from a life cycle perspective for the production steps in average concrete from this particular country, let's say Sweden, for instance. This is what we believe the total emissions are like. But I mean, the only way to kind of validate that is to actually get the data from the cement or concrete manufacturer. But at least it's a start. And I think it's a very important start. I mean, we sometimes get the question, why is scope 3 important when global emissions are just adding up scope 1 emissions? And it is incredibly important because otherwise you kind of have a global race to the bottom. There will always be companies that have no problems whatsoever taking on all of the world's scope 1 emissions and making a ton of money. Our own emissions are going down because our own energy grid is so clean. I mean, we're adapting electric vehicles. But if you look at it from a scope 3 lens, I mean, all of the goods and services that we are essentially importing from other countries, like China, where there's a lot of coal, where some of those factories might not care about the production methodologies. If you add that together, Sweden's carbon emissions have actually gone up with quite a bit. So that's a little bit what I'm meaning by moving production to other places where there might not be the same, incentives or regulations to care about it.
Sure.
So does it even make sense to think about it on a country by country basis though? Because I mean, you've just been at COP26. It's all on the basis of national, sort of, it makes a mockery almost of that whole system. If you could just sort of outsource your emissions to another country, right?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. And I think that is overall, the problem, and that is why Scope 3 is so incredibly important. I mean, the same way we have come to realize that, if you have slave labor in your supply chain, that is your problem. That is not their problem. That is your problem. That is your, and I think from a risk perspective as well, I mean, you have a clear social cost of carbon, right? And right now, I mean, the real cost of carbon that companies are paying for releasing carbon is not that high. But eventually in time, if you believe that markets are at least somewhat efficient, and the public outcry will be larger and larger as this crisis intensifies, then the cost of carbon that I'm paying today will converge towards the social cost of carbon. Yeah. And if you don't have control of your Scope 3, then, as the price of polluting is increasing, then you need to kind of ask yourself, will you even be a profitable business if you would actually pay the real price for your carbon in your supply chain? And reorienting your supply chain, that can take many years. So you better start now and mitigate those risks.
Yeah. That's actually another point you're making here, which is also very important, which is managing your emission just makes business sense. One, because carbon is getting priced. And so it's going to, for businesses that are carbon intensive, going to become even more challenging to operate profitably. And two, you mentioned as well, your customers, consumers are starting to pay attention and asking for transparency. And so, if you don't do things right, customers might switch, vote with their feet, as they say. Now that's super interesting. And in a way, we can see how carbon management will become part of the toolkit of any business, in a way.
Well, speaking of which, obviously, we know that some companies are using internal carbon pricing, almost anticipating potentially the introduction of a carbon tax. I mean, what do you think about a carbon tax? Do you think that's on its way?
I mean, it's impossible to speculate. Of course, a carbon tax would be very welcomed. So if you look at some of the modeling out there, carbon tax will take time to implement. So we need to do it as soon as possible. But also, I think there are some things where it just kind of makes sense, eventually to almost make it illegal, right? I mean, if we have alternative production methodologies that release, zero carbon, sometimes you might not even need a carbon tax. You just need to say, I mean, we need you to switch to this other thing, right?
So I guess that's, instead of, you've got the one direction of a carbon tax, and then you've got the other side of, well, maybe we don't need a carbon tax, as if the price of carbon is priced correctly. Do you think that we're able to get to a kind of right price of carbon with the sort of various, market distortions that we see? Or, I mean, do you have any views on, you didn't get a whisper from anyone at COP26 about, what should the carbon price be?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you always need to be an optimist, right? I mean, all climate communication tells us that, we need to be optimistic and believe in our own abilities. But, to be quite frank, I mean, I don't think we will, be able to get it there in time for 1.5 to really happen. But again, 1.5 is incredibly important, because for every inch of a degree that we raise, the risks go up almost exponentially. But we need to understand that it's still a continuum. So I mean, just because we won't be able to get to 1.5 in time, or a carbon tax in time, doesn't mean that we shouldn't act at all. Like every single fraction of a degree counts. So I mean, I know that this was a little bit vague of an answer of saying that I'm not super optimistic, given the fact that if you take all commitments together, it's 2.4 degrees. Carbon taxes that are really rigorous doesn't seem to be very much in sight. But all the difference that we can do right now, I mean, especially as businesses, and try to not wait for the carbon tax to happen, but actually act and anticipate it. It's
and actually on that point, just to give us a bit of hope, because I mean, you have already many customers. You must have like really good stories about some of them being able to significantly reduce their emission using your normative. Can you share some of those?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I can say also that, I mean, we, if you take all of the carbon that we have accounted for and add it up, it equates to the total carbon emission of a country like Tajikistan. And now we're, pushing our customer base, we always are, to, can you actually take the right actions in order to reduce their emissions? I mean, I think one, success story that I like to bring up is a company that are doing, disposable cups and napkins and so on. And I mean, they actually have used our data to convince their customers to choose the more sustainable option for cups and napkins and so on, and actually managed to reduce their emissions as a result. And I mean, there's one bank client that we had that, okay, like a large chunk of your scope 3 emissions is actually the printing of your plastic cards. and that was a little bit of a surprise both to us and to them, and they're, taking actions based on that. So I mean, there's plenty of good examples.
Well, I suppose one of the biggest, success stories is actually you here on this call. I mean, your companies in your space are just taking off like, incredible, like rockets. So, where do you see yourself? Where do you see yourself going? Where do you see this whole sector going?
Good question. So I think carbon accounting will be as common amongst, a certain size of companies as, your normal kind of financial accounting. So, I mean, I think what we're building here will be, kind of similar to the next SAP. But what I think is, I don't think SAP, sorry if, SAP or someone from SAP is in the audience, it's not one of the, sexiest, perhaps brands out there, but it has been, an incredibly consequential company. I think another thing that is quite exciting as well is, since we're solving this whole comparability problem where you can actually compare apples to apples in large portfolios, I think, our data can and will be used more and more by, financial players. So, I mean, I imagine a future where, carbon data is integrated into the, Bloomberg terminal and procurement systems and open banking and invoice systems and all sorts of overall, infrastructure the same way, a P&L and accounting and financial numbers are integrated all across the place. So that is a little bit the future that I foresee.
Yeah. So you're describing a revolution that's bigger than the fintech revolution, the carbon tech revolution.
Yes. Yes.
And do you see this as a global thing, or do you see a particular jurisdiction as being most interested?
I mean, right now, Europe is biggest, and in a lot of regulatory framework, Europe is leading the way, which I think is good. I mean, you had the same thing with energy efficiency standards that started in Europe, and then that becomes the new norm all across the world. I mean, what is fortunate when it comes to climate change is that, everyone is waking up. Every single country on the planet is waking up to this problem. So, I mean, global problem means, global market in the end of the day as well.
Yeah, and global action, which It's good to see. Well, Kristian, I'd like to really thank you for joining us this afternoon. I think it was we learned a ton, but we should pause there. And thanks again, Kristian and Zoë, for this good discussion.
Thanks, Kristian.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Talks podcast. To find out more or join as a guest, head over to the ETF Partners website at etfpartners.capital. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Medium at ETF Partners. Until next time, thanks for listening.